Have you decided how to divide the money yet? My daughter-in-law asked me less than an hour after my husband was buried. I looked at her across the church reception hall and said nothing. What she didn't know was that I had already made a decision. What she also didn't know was that my late husband had spent the last year preparing for this exact moment. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 72 years old, and on the day my husband Charles passed away, I kept two secrets to myself. The first was about a $28 million inheritance. The second was about a letter that no one in my family knew existed. I'm telling this story now because sometimes silence reveals more than words ever could. The day of Charles's funeral began beneath a gray October sky. The air carried the crisp chill of early autumn, and fallen leaves gathered along the sidewalks outside St. Andrew's Church. Friends, neighbors, former coworkers, and distant relatives filled the pews. Everyone spoke softly. Everyone offered condolences. Everyone seemed focused on honoring the man we had lost. Everyone except my daughter-in-law, Brittany. Throughout the service, I noticed her glancing toward Ryan, my son. They exchanged quiet looks whenever the pastor mentioned Charles's business success. They whispered to each other during moments that should have been devoted to reflection. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Grief has a way of making ordinary behavior seem suspicious. But the feeling stayed with me. Charles and I had been married for 46 years. We built our life together from almost nothing. We raised Ryan in a modest home outside Columbus, Ohio. We worked hard. We saved carefully. Over the decades, Charles expanded a small manufacturing company into a thriving business. Few people understood how much effort it had taken. Fewer still knew the true value of everything he owned. To most people, Charles was simply a successful businessman. To me, he was the man who brought me coffee every morning and remembered every anniversary without fail. Losing him felt like losing half the rhythm of my life. After the funeral service, guests gathered in the reception hall next door. Tables were covered with white linens. Coffee urns sat beside trays of pastries. People shared stories about Charles and offered kind words. I appreciated every one of them. Yet beneath the surface of the gathering, another conversation seemed to be unfolding. Ryan approached me first. He placed a hand on my shoulder and asked whether I was holding up all right. His voice sounded concerned, but his eyes drifted elsewhere. Then Brittany joined us. She smiled politely and asked whether Charles had left detailed instructions about his estate. The question came so quickly that it caught me off guard. Not because I didn't expect it eventually, but because I expected more time. A little more patience. A little more respect for the day we had just endured. I simply told her that there would be time to discuss such matters later. She nodded, but disappointment flickered across her face before she could hide it. That was when I realized something important. They were not wondering whether there was an inheritance. They were already assuming there was one. As the afternoon continued, I watched them carefully. I listened more than I spoke. And with every passing hour, a quiet certainty began to form in my mind. Charles had been right. Months before his passing, he had warned me that money reveals character faster than almost anything else. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Standing there in that reception hall, I began to understand exactly what he meant. Hidden inside my purse was an envelope that Charles had instructed me not to open until after his funeral. I could feel its weight every time I moved. I had not yet read the contents, but somehow I knew that whatever waited inside that envelope was about to change everything. I did not open the envelope that night. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen table beside my coffee mug and stared at it while darkness settled outside the windows. The house felt unfamiliar without Charles. For 46 years, there had always been another presence in the room. A newspaper folded beside his chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle. The sound of his footsteps moving down the hallway before sunrise. Now there was only silence. I slept very little. Every creak of the old house seemed louder than usual. Every memory felt sharper. The next morning I woke before dawn and sat on the back porch wrapped in a blanket. The October air was cold enough to make me pull it tighter around my shoulders. Across the yard, the maple trees were painted in shades of red and gold. Charles had loved that view. He used to say that autumn was proof that change could still be beautiful. At the time, I never understood why he repeated that phrase so often. Now I wondered if he had been preparing me for life without him. Around 8 o'clock my phone rang. It was Ryan. His voice sounded cheerful, almost unusually cheerful considering everything that had happened. He asked whether I needed groceries, help with errands, or anything else around the house. For a moment I felt grateful. Then the conversation shifted. Slowly, carefully. He asked whether I had spoken with the attorney yet. I told him I had not. He paused for a second before saying he was only trying to help make things easier for me. After we hung up, I sat quietly and thought about the conversation. Years ago, Ryan would have called simply to ask how I was feeling. Now every discussion seemed to circle back to business matters. Before noon, Brittany called as well. She sounded warm and concerned. She asked whether I was eating enough and getting proper rest. Then she casually mentioned that managing a large estate could become overwhelming for someone my age. The words were polite. The meaning underneath them was not. By lunchtime, I realized they were both testing the same question from different directions. They wanted information. They wanted reassurance. Most of all, they wanted certainty about what Charles had left behind. I still said nothing. That afternoon, I finally picked up the envelope. The paper felt thick and expensive. Charles always appreciated details like that. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Strong, deliberate, familiar. I began reading slowly. The first lines were not about money. They were about trust. Charles wrote that wealth could protect a family or destroy one. He wrote that character revealed itself most clearly when people believed a reward was within reach. Then I reached a sentence that made me stop breathing for a moment. He explained that the inheritance plan everyone expected no longer existed. He had changed everything months earlier. He had done so quietly and legally. Most importantly, he had created conditions that would only be revealed after certain events unfolded. Charles was not trying to punish anyone. He was trying to expose the truth. At the bottom of the page, he included a short instruction. Meet Martin before making any decisions. Say nothing until then. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. For the first time since the funeral, I understood why Charles had seemed so calm during his final months. He already knew something that the rest of us did not. And somehow I had the feeling that the real story was only beginning. 2 days later, I drove downtown to meet Martin Hayes. The law office occupied the top floor of a brick building that Charles had always admired. I arrived 15 minutes early. Old habits are difficult to break. Charles believed that showing up on time was a sign of respect, and after nearly half a century together, some of his habits had become my own. Martin greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room overlooking the city. For a few moments, neither of us discussed legal matters. We spoke about Charles instead, about his sense of humor, about his work ethic, about the way he could walk into a room and make everyone feel comfortable. Then Martin opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. The expression on his face changed. It became more serious, more deliberate. He told me that Charles had visited him multiple times during the previous year. Not because he was afraid of dying, because he was worried about what might happen afterward. I listened quietly. Martin explained that Charles had noticed changes within the family. Small things at first. Conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Questions about company assets that seemed oddly specific. Growing interest in financial matters that had never attracted attention before. Charles did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. He simply paid attention. That was one of his greatest strengths. He noticed details other people ignored. Martin slid a document toward me. It was dated 8 months earlier. Charles had personally instructed him to create a series of safeguards around the estate. Not to protect the money, to protect the truth. According to Martin, the inheritance structure now included review periods, disclosure requirements, and specific conditions tied to future distributions. Certain decisions would only take effect after patterns of behavior became clear. I could almost hear Charles speaking through the legal language. Patient, methodical, watching several moves ahead. As Martin explained the details, my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen. Ryan. I silenced the call. A minute later, another message appeared. This time from Brittany. She wanted to know whether I had met with the attorney yet. The timing struck me as unusual. Neither of them knew where I was. Yet both seemed eager for updates. Martin noticed my expression but said nothing. After the meeting ended, I stopped at a small cafe near the courthouse. Charles and I used to eat lunch there when we were younger. I ordered soup and coffee and sat beside the window. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalks carrying briefcases and shopping bags. Life continued moving forward. Mine felt suspended between the past and the future. When I finally checked my messages, I found 3 missed calls and 2 texts. Ryan suggested that we should begin discussing practical matters regarding the house. Brittany offered to help organize financial paperwork. The offers sounded generous on the surface. Yet something felt rehearsed about them. Coordinated. Later that evening, Ryan and Brittany arrived unexpectedly. They carried a casserole dish and wore sympathetic smiles. We sat around the kitchen table while they spoke about family, responsibility, and planning ahead. I listened carefully. The conversation drifted toward property taxes, then investment accounts, then the company Charles had built. Each subject appeared naturally, yet every road seemed to lead to the same destination: money. For the first time, I noticed how often Brittany answered questions directed at Ryan, how frequently she guided the discussion, how quickly she redirected topics whenever emotions entered the conversation. When they finally left, I stood at the front window and watched their car disappear down the street. Then I returned to the kitchen and opened Charles's letter once more. One sentence stood out differently than before. Wealth does not change people. It reveals them. Sitting alone beneath the soft light above the table, I began to wonder how much of the truth was already revealing itself. Over the next week, I began noticing things that I might have overlooked before. Grief has a strange way of sharpening certain details while dulling others. Every morning I followed the same routine. I made coffee. I watered the plants Charles had cared for. I sat by the kitchen window and watched the neighborhood wake up. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, however, I felt as though I had stepped into a different world. Ryan called almost every day. First, that seemed comforting. Then I realized that nearly every conversation eventually returned to practical matters. He wanted to know whether I planned to remain in the house. He wondered if maintaining such a large property would become difficult. He mentioned several attractive retirement communities he had researched online. His tone remained polite, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Brittany's interest grew even more noticeable. She began sending me listings for smaller homes and condominiums. She framed everything as concern for my well-being. She said she wanted me to enjoy a simpler lifestyle. She reminded me that managing finances could become stressful. I thanked her each time and made no commitments. The more they spoke, the less I responded. Silence became useful. People reveal a great deal when they believe nobody is resisting them. One Thursday afternoon, Brittany invited me to lunch at a restaurant near their neighborhood. The place was bright and cheerful. Families filled the tables. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the dining room. We ordered sandwiches and soup. For the first 15 minutes, the conversation remained pleasant. Then she carefully steered it toward the future. She asked whether Charles had ever discussed transferring assets before his passing. She wondered whether certain accounts would require immediate action. She even mentioned that delays could create complications. I listened quietly and stirred my coffee. Then I asked a simple question. Why are you so worried about timing? For the first time, she seemed uncomfortable. The answer came quickly but not naturally. She said she only wanted to help. The subject changed moments later. As I drove home, I thought about the expression on her face. It reminded me of someone checking whether a locked door had been left open. Later that evening, I searched through old photographs stored in the study. Many showed Ryan as a child. There he was at 10 years old holding a baseball glove almost as large as he was. There he was graduating from high school. There he was smiling beside Charles after receiving his first promotion. Looking at those pictures hurt more than I expected. Somewhere along the way, something had changed. Perhaps it happened gradually. Perhaps I simply refused to see it. A few days later, Martin called with an update. He informed me that certain administrative steps were progressing exactly as Charles intended. He also reminded me not to discuss estate details with anyone. His voice carried a confidence that reassured me. Before ending the call, he said something that stayed with me. The truth usually arrives long before people are ready for it. That night, I sat alone in the living room and replayed recent conversations in my mind. Individual moments began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. The repeated questions, the sudden concern about property, the unusual urgency. None of it proved anything by itself. Yet together, the pattern became difficult to dismiss. For the first time, I found myself wondering not what Ryan and Brittany hoped to gain, but how far they believed they had already come. And deep down, I suspected they were growing more confident with every day that passed. The following Monday, something happened that confirmed many of the suspicions I had quietly carried for days. Ryan arrived at my house without calling ahead. That alone was unusual. He had always been considerate about visiting. This time, however, he appeared restless. He paced through the living room while pretending to admire family photographs. He asked whether I had spoken with Martin recently. He asked whether there were any updates regarding the estate. He asked whether Charles had left written instructions beyond the will. The questions came one after another, each disguised as concern. I answered politely but revealed nothing. After nearly an hour, he finally sat down across from me at the dining table. The same table where Charles and I had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and countless ordinary evenings together. Ryan folded his hands and looked directly at me. Then he suggested that it might be wise to begin transferring certain responsibilities before everything became complicated. The phrase caught my attention. Complicated for whom, I wondered. He explained that financial matters could become overwhelming. He reminded me of my age. He mentioned that Brittany had experience organizing paperwork and investments. I listened quietly. The conversation sounded familiar because I had heard versions of it several times already. Only now the message felt less subtle. When Ryan finally left, I walked to the front window and watched him pull out of the driveway. As his vehicle disappeared around the corner, another car entered the neighborhood. It was Martin. He parked beside the curb and carried a leather briefcase to my front door. We sat in the study where Charles used to review business reports. The room still smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Martin opened his briefcase and removed several documents. Then he shared information that Charles had specifically instructed him to reveal only when the time was right. Months before his passing, Charles had established a confidential review process connected to the estate. The purpose was simple. Certain beneficiaries would only receive future distributions if their conduct demonstrated genuine concern for family rather than personal gain. The language was legal, but the meaning was unmistakable. Charles had anticipated pressure. He had anticipated manipulation. Most remarkably, he had anticipated exactly where it might come from. Martin also showed me records of conversations Charles had documented during his final year. Notes, observations, dates. Nothing dramatic. Nothing malicious. Just a careful record of patterns. Questions about money. Discussions about property. Repeated attempts to learn details that Charles intentionally kept private. Reading those pages felt like looking through a window into his thoughts. He had seen far more than I realized. After Martin left, I sat alone for a long time. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. Dust drifted lazily through the beams of light near the window. The house was quiet. Yet for the first time in weeks the silence felt different. It no longer felt empty. It felt purposeful. That evening Brittany called again. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She explained that she and Ryan had been discussing possible renovations for the property. Renovations. The word nearly made me smile. They were discussing changes to a house that did not belong to them. She spoke confidently about future plans, future investments, and future opportunities. I offered only brief responses. The more she talked, the more certain I became that neither of them understood how little they actually knew. After the call ended, I opened Charles's letter once again. By then, I had read it enough times to recognize every curve of his handwriting. One sentence held my attention longer than the others. Trust actions more than words. I closed the letter and looked out into the darkening yard. Somewhere beyond the windows, autumn leaves drifted across the grass. Inside the house, another truth was slowly taking shape. Ryan and Brittany believed they were moving closer to their goal. In reality, with every conversation, every question, and every assumption they made, They were revealing exactly what Charles had been waiting to see. 3 weeks after the funeral, Ryan called and asked if he and Brittany could stop by for dinner. His voice sounded relaxed, almost confident. By then, I had learned to pay attention not only to what people said but to how they said it. Confidence often appears when people believe the outcome is already decided. I agreed to the visit. That evening, they arrived carrying a pie from a local bakery and a bottle of sparkling cider. The atmosphere felt unusually cheerful. We shared a simple meal and talked about ordinary things. Ryan discussed work. Brittany talked about a community event she had attended. For a while it almost felt like old times. Then, as expected, the conversation slowly shifted. Brittany mentioned that several homes in my neighborhood had recently sold for impressive prices. Ryan added that the real estate market was still strong. I listened quietly while finishing my coffee. A few minutes later, Brittany removed a folder from her handbag and placed it gently on the table. She smiled and explained that she had gathered some information that might help me plan for the future. Inside were brochures from retirement communities, property evaluations, and financial planning documents. Everything looked professional. Everything looked carefully prepared. Ryan leaned forward and explained that they were only thinking about what would be best for me. He spoke about convenience, security, and reducing stress. Then he suggested that selling the house sooner rather than later might be the smartest decision. I looked around the dining room. Every wall carried memories. Every piece of furniture held part of a life Charles and I had built together. The suggestion itself did not upset me. What caught my attention was the speed. Less than a month had passed. Yet they were already discussing permanent changes as though the decision had been made. I thanked them for their concern and said I would think about it. The answer seemed to disappoint them. Not openly. Just enough for me to notice. After they left, I gathered the brochures and placed them in a drawer without reading them. The next morning Martin called. He informed me that a formal family meeting had been scheduled for the following month. Several legal reviews would be completed by then, and important information regarding the estate would finally be disclosed. I asked whether everyone had been notified. He said yes. His voice carried a calm certainty that reminded me of Charles. Before ending the call, he told me something interesting. In recent weeks, multiple inquiries had been made regarding estate assets. The requests had not come from me. They had not come from Martin's office either. Someone else was trying very hard to gather information. I already knew who that someone was likely to be. As the days passed, Ryan and Brittany became increasingly attentive. They called more often. They offered more assistance. They asked more questions. Yet the pattern remained unchanged. Every conversation eventually returned to finances, property, or future plans. It was as though they were following a script. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork in the study, I discovered an old photograph tucked inside a book. It showed Charles standing beside Ryan at a fishing lake many years ago. Both were smiling. Both looked genuinely happy. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I remembered something Charles once told me. Character is easiest to see when people believe nobody is watching. Looking back, I realized he had been watching for a very long time. The family meeting was now only a few weeks away. Ryan and Brittany appeared more confident than ever. They spoke about the future as though it already belonged to them. What they did not understand was that every assumption they made was bringing them closer to a truth neither of them expected. And when that truth finally arrived, nothing would unfold the way they imagined. The morning of the family meeting arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for late autumn. I woke before sunrise and sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee. The yard was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves drifting across the grass. For the first time in many weeks I felt calm. Not because I knew exactly what would happen, but because I finally understood what Charles had been trying to teach me. Truth has its own schedule. It arrives when it is ready. By 10 o'clock I was driving toward Martin's office. The meeting had been arranged in a large conference room overlooking downtown Columbus. When I arrived, Ryan and Brittany were already there. Their expressions were confident, relaxed. Brittany greeted me warmly and offered to help me with my coat. Ryan asked how I was feeling and whether I had slept well. Their concern sounded polished, almost rehearsed. As we waited, I noticed several folders arranged neatly on the conference table. Martin entered a few minutes later carrying additional documents. He greeted everyone professionally and explained that the purpose of the meeting was to review the estate structure, outstanding obligations, and future administrative steps. The room became very quiet. Ryan leaned forward slightly. Brittany folded her hands and smiled. Martin began with routine matters: property records, tax considerations, business ownership transitions. Everything was presented carefully and methodically. I watched Ryan grow increasingly impatient as the discussion continued. He seemed less interested in the details than in reaching a specific conclusion. Eventually, he interrupted and asked the question that had clearly been on his mind for weeks. He wanted to know when the inheritance distributions would occur. The room fell silent for a moment. Martin looked down at his notes before responding. He explained that several conditions established by Charles would need to be reviewed before any future distributions could be considered. Ryan appeared surprised. Brittany looked confused. Martin continued speaking. He explained that Charles had personally designed a structure intended to protect both family relationships and long-term stewardship of the estate. Certain evaluations had already been completed. Others were still under review. The confidence I had seen in Ryan and Brittany began to fade slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Then Martin revealed something else. During the previous year, Charles had documented concerns regarding repeated attempts to obtain confidential financial information. No accusations were made. No names were mentioned. Yet the statement alone seemed to change the atmosphere inside the room. Brittany shifted in her chair. Ryan glanced toward her before looking back at Martin. The conversation moved forward, but the energy had changed. Questions became more cautious. Responses became shorter. I remained quiet throughout most of the meeting. There was no reason to speak. Charles had already said everything that needed to be said through the plans he left behind. Near the end, Martin informed everyone that a final disclosure session would take place soon after the remaining reviews were completed. At that point, all relevant provisions would be revealed in full. Ryan immediately asked how long that process would take. Martin replied that it would not be much longer. As the meeting concluded, Brittany approached me in the hallway. Her smile seemed strained. She asked whether I knew more than had been discussed during the session. I looked at her for a moment and simply said that Charles always believed patience was important. Her expression hardened for the briefest instant before she forced another smile. On the drive home, I thought about everything I had witnessed. For weeks, Ryan and Brittany had behaved as though the future belonged to them. Now uncertainty had entered the picture. For the first time, they were beginning to realize that Charles had anticipated far more than they ever imagined. And the most important revelation was still waiting ahead. The final disclosure session took place 10 days later. By then, the tension that had quietly grown beneath the surface was impossible to ignore. Ryan called less often, but when he did, his questions were more direct. Brittany remained polite, yet her patience seemed thinner with every conversation. They both sensed that something important was approaching. They simply did not know what. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived at Martin's office a few minutes early. The same conference room had been reserved. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows, and sunlight reflected from the glass buildings outside. Everything appeared calm. Inside the room, however, anticipation hung in the air. Ryan and Brittany entered together. They greeted me warmly, but I noticed how quickly their attention shifted toward the documents waiting on the table. Martin arrived shortly afterward carrying a thick folder. Unlike previous meetings, there was very little small talk. Everyone seemed eager to reach the purpose of the gathering. Martin began by reviewing several administrative matters. Then he opened the folder and informed us that all required reviews had been completed. The estate structure Charles established could now be disclosed in full. Ryan straightened in his chair. Brittany folded her hands together and focused intently on Martin. The room grew silent. Martin explained that Charles had reorganized his holdings nearly a year before his passing. Business interests, investment accounts, trust assets, and property ownership had all been updated under a comprehensive estate plan. He then revealed the first major detail. The primary beneficiary of the estate was not Ryan. It was me. For a moment nobody spoke. Ryan blinked several times as though he had misheard. Brittany's expression froze completely. Martin continued calmly. The estate, valued at approximately $28 million, had been placed under my direct control. Every major asset, every investment account, every property interest, everything. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Ryan finally asked whether there had been some kind of mistake. Martin assured him there had not. The documents were clear. The instructions were detailed. Most importantly, they reflected Charles's deliberate wishes. Then came the second revelation. Charles had established a family trust designed to support future generations. However, access to that trust would depend upon specific behavioral standards outlined before his passing. Individuals who attempted to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence estate decisions could lose eligibility for future benefits. Again, no names were mentioned. No accusations were made. Yet everyone understood the meaning. Martin then read a statement Charles had personally written. In it, he explained that wealth should strengthen families rather than divide them. He expressed hope that those he loved would value relationships more than financial outcomes. As the words filled the room, I felt as though Charles was speaking directly to us. Ryan lowered his eyes toward the table. Brittany remained perfectly still. The confidence they had carried for weeks seemed to disappear entirely. What struck me most was not their disappointment. It was their surprise. They had spent so much time assuming they understood the situation that they never considered another possibility. When the meeting ended, Ryan approached me slowly. For the first time in many weeks, he seemed uncertain about what to say. Brittany remained near the doorway, unusually quiet. I gathered my belongings and thanked Martin for his work. As I stood to leave, I looked around the room one final time. The secret Charles had protected so carefully was no longer a secret. The truth was finally visible to everyone. Yet even then, I sensed that the most important part of his plan had never been about money at all. It had been about revealing what people chose to show when they believed nobody could see behind the curtain. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not because everything had been resolved, but because the truth had finally removed the need for guessing. Ryan called a few days after the meeting and asked if we could have lunch together. Just the two of us. We met at a small diner that Charles used to enjoy. The same red booths. The same coffee mugs. The same view of traffic moving slowly along Main Street. For several minutes, neither of us discussed the estate. We talked about ordinary things instead. The weather, work, old family memories. Then Ryan finally looked at me and admitted that he had made assumptions. He said he thought he understood what Charles intended. He said he believed he was helping plan for the future. As I listened, I realized something important. Greed does not always arrive wearing an obvious face. Sometimes it disguises itself as entitlement. Sometimes people convince themselves they deserve something before it ever belongs to them. I told Ryan that his father never cared most about money. He cared about judgment, responsibility, character. Those were the things he spent a lifetime building. Ryan lowered his eyes and nodded slowly. Whether he fully understood in that moment, I could not say. But for the first time in months, he seemed willing to listen rather than persuade. Brittany remained more distant. She was never openly hostile. She simply became quieter. The confidence that had once shaped every conversation disappeared almost overnight. I did not hold anger toward her. Resentment would not bring Charles back. It would not improve the future either. Instead, I chose something that surprised even me. I chose peace. Over the following months, I worked closely with Martin to carry out Charles's wishes. The family trust remained intact. The charitable projects Charles supported continued receiving funding. Scholarships were established in his name for local students pursuing engineering and manufacturing careers. Every decision reflected values he had spent decades living by. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the final disclosure meeting, I returned to the fishing lake where Charles had taken Ryan as a boy. The water was calm. Sunlight danced across the surface. I sat on a weathered bench overlooking the shoreline and brought with me the final letter Charles had written. By then I had read it many times. Yet one paragraph always stayed with me. He wrote that success should never be measured by the size of an inheritance. It should be measured by the kind of people left behind. As I looked across the lake, I finally understood what he meant. The $28 million had never been the true inheritance. The real inheritance was the lesson hidden inside everything that happened afterward. Money revealed fears, assumptions, priorities. It exposed weaknesses and strengths alike. Most of all, it revealed the difference between ownership and gratitude. Before leaving the lake, I folded the letter one final time and slipped it back into my purse. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying away the last leaves of autumn. For the first time since Charles passed away, I felt something close to peace. He had trusted me with more than an estate. He had trusted me with the truth. And in the end, that truth proved more valuable than any number written on a financial statement. The money remained. The properties remained. The investments remained. But those were never the things that mattered most. What mattered was understanding who people become when they believe nobody is watching. Charles understood that lesson long before any of us did. In the end, he did not leave me $28 million. He left me clarity. And that was the inheritance that changed everything.